Chapter 2, The Keys and the Treehouse. I'm not sure if it was good planning or just sheer luck, but we moved to Brimpton on the day the school summer holidays started. This meant I would start at my new school at the start of a whole new school year, so hopefully wouldn't be the only new kid there. It also meant I had the whole of the summer holidays to explore this new wilderness. In London, I'd favoured staying in watching TV or gaming with my friends online. Here in Frog's Bottom Lane, we were to be without an internet connection for the first couple of weeks of moving in, and therefore I would be forced to find my own entertainment. I was to discover something much worse than that though. For the first couple of weeks we could only receive 5 television channels. Seriously? 5 channels? What was this, the Dark Ages or something? I would distract myself by exploring the house and garden. This at least might stop me from dying of boredom. Our nearest neighbours were Ted and Rowena Hawkins. They owned and farmed the land that bordered our property, and in time they would come to be very close friends. Their farmhouse was about 1.5 miles down the lane, and they had no children, so unfortunately there looked to be no chances of finding a playmate until I returned to school in the autumn. I would just have to make my own entertainment. Dad had been given time off work, compassionate leave I think they called it. However, he was busy trying to fix things around the house and getting his office ready to allow him to work from home. I'd heard him on the telephone to a number of electricity companies, trying to find out who had supplied the power to the house. He'd been unable to find an electricity meter, and all the largest suppliers claimed that although electricity had been introduced to the village in 1914, to this date they had never supplied to this particular property. It would remain a mystery for some time, although Dad wasn't complaining. For now, he was getting free electricity. The estate agent, Mr. Higgins, who had sold us the cottage, had said that it had stood empty for the last 2 years. He had been instructed to sell it by a client who had communicated purely by post and telephone. Being a local man, he had known the previous occupier, but only to say hello to. He had described her as quite a solitary figure who kept herself to herself. He believed her name to be Margaret Thomas, and this would tend to be supported by the post that had obviously kept arriving long after her disappearance, given the mountain of paperwork that had collected behind the front door. Mr. Higgins didn't think that she'd had any children, and wasn't sure how long she had lived here, although he had lived in the area for 45 years, and she had been the only person to live here during that time. He had commented that he believed that she should be 100 or so years old, as she'd seemed old 45 years ago. He explained that she must have had a hard paper round as a kid, and may have looked older than her years. He wasn't able to say how or why she had disappeared, as nobody looked after her as such. Nobody could recall an exact date when they had last seen her at the house. Despite her age, Margaret had been fiercely independent, and had shown none of the usual frailties associated with old age. Although she didn't drive, she would often be seen pacing out the 3-mile walk into the village, and then returning with a couple of bags of shopping. Occasionally, passers-by would offer to give her a lift home, but she would kindly decline the offer, claiming the fresh air and the exercise would do her good. After a couple of weeks of absence from the shop, PC Andrew Brown, the village police officer, had attended the address to find a note taped to the back door, explaining that Margaret had left and that the probate solicitor in London could be contacted to arrange for a sale of the property. We asked him where number 1 Frog's Bottom was, as our house was number 2, but appeared to be the only house on the lane. He explained that our house had previously been 2 cottages built for the farm workers. There had been a mysterious fire in 1897 which had started in the thatch and gutted both of the cottages, killing the occupants of both houses except for the teenage daughter of the occupants of number 2. The farmer at the time, also a Mr. Hawkins, and I guess to be the current farmer Hawkins' grandfather, had renovated the cottages, but rather than return them to 2, had decided to knock through and reinstate them as 1 cottage. Mr. Higgins wasn't sure why he should have chosen to call it number 2, but that's what he believed happened to number 1. As I explored the garden, I was delighted, but also a little puzzled to discover a tree house. Mr. Higgins had claimed that Margaret lived here alone. Why then would a lady, who at a conservative estimate must have been in her 90s, feel the need for a tree house? And who had built it for her? This was not a conventional tree house. It wrapped around the main trunk, rather than perched on outlying branches. The tree was an oak and was clearly 200 or more years old itself. It was not immediately obvious how to access the treehouse, although standing beneath, I could just about make out what looked like a trapdoor and a small rope extending through a hole next to the trapdoor. There must have been a ladder at some time, but one was not immediately obvious in the garden right now. I asked Dad if he had one that I could borrow, but he advised me that he would need to check that it was safe to play in first. There was what looked like an aerial or an antenna reaching up through the roof and up through the branches of the tree. Perhaps Mrs. Thomas had been a radio ham in her spare time. A metal strap led down from the base of the treehouse, down the trunk and into the ground. Dad said this was a lightning conductor. Clearly the tree was of a size that made it a risk of being struck. I had Googled Brimpton when Mum and Dad had announced we were to move here, and had discovered that the village had one of the highest rates of lightning strike in the country. This caused scientists some confusion, as the geology didn't seem to support this phenomenon. As I explored the garden, I became aware of a faint humming that seemed to be coming from the top of the garden. I followed the sound until I got to the shed. I placed my ear to the keyhole and listened. I realised it was more of a faint vibration than a hum. It seemed rhythmic, as if it were following a sequence. It must be coming from whatever lay beneath the tarpaulin. I was now more desperate than ever to get into the shed, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the door to budge. It was no use, I would have to try and find the key. The lock casing seemed too big for what you would expect to find on a shed door. In fact, it wouldn't have looked out of place in a castle. I realised the key would be quite large, and therefore hopefully not too hard to find. I spent the rest of the morning in the garden, lifting plant pots, moving rocks, digging small holes, but alas, no key could be found. Nobody besides me seemed in any great hurry to get into the shed. We hadn't had our own garden in London, and therefore we hadn't accumulated any of the usual items that you would most likely need to put in a shed, like a lawnmower or tools or plant pots. I guessed that there were plenty of other jobs that needed doing, and there were a couple of other outbuildings that would serve as storage areas for now. This would have to be my mission and mine alone. I tried to imagine where I would hide a key if I had to. The house had a cellar, but I didn't much fancy poking about down there. From what I had seen, it was cold and dark. It also smelt funny. I've always had a healthy imagination, and combined with some of the horror films I'd watched with Robbie, I could imagine all sorts of horrors waiting for me down there. Later that afternoon, Dad informed me that he had found a ladder, and as far as he could tell, the tree house was as good as the day it had been built. It was, however, quite high off the ground, so I was made to promise that I would be careful climbing in and out. As I climbed to the top of the ladder, I was able to reach the short length of the rope which was extending through the hole next to the trapdoor. I expected to have to use a great deal of effort to lift the heavy door, expecting the hinges to be old and rusty, but in fact I found I could easily lift it with just a slight tug on the rope. As I raised my head cautiously into the space above, I was amazed to discover a large floor area with other hinged boxes, ropes and pulleys. I climbed through and closed the trapdoor behind me. I didn't fancy falling 15 foot back to earth. As I closed the door, a sequence of ropes and cogs opened another panel in the roof, revealing the horizon off to the east and an area of sky. There were strange markings on the wall that looked like mathematical symbols, but none that I recognised. Perhaps they were instructions written in a foreign language. The outer walls of the treehouse formed an octagonal shape, with wooden props below, returning the weight of the treehouse and anything supported within it back to the trunk of the tree. It was clearly well engineered and looked capable of supporting a considerable weight. It seemed a little over the top for a treehouse, unless it was designed with another purpose in mind. The treehouse was open plan, not divided into separate rooms, which meant I could walk in a complete circle around the entire open room, with just the trunk running down the middle and the hinged boxes along the outer walls. I imagined that I would be spending quite a lot of my time in this new den. Although I was told I was to allow Sophie to play in it also, I was delighted to find that she would not venture more than 3 steps up the ladder before turning back. For now at least, this was my domain. To my continued frustration, I found that I was unable to lift the lid of any of the 4 boxes that surrounded the room, although it wasn't immediately obvious what should be stopping me. There was no lock that I could distinguish, just 3 raised discs on the lid of each box, each with a sequence of strange markings carved into them. Perhaps they were instructions for opening the lids. A symbol on one of the discs looked vaguely familiar. I'd seen it recently but couldn't recall where. I returned to the house and collected some greaseproof paper and wax crayons. Returning to the tree house, I placed the paper on each of the 3 lids and rubbed with the crayon. I had seen this done in churches and on old gravestones. Once the symbols were transferred to the paper, I climbed down from the tree house, careful to close the hatch and remove the ladder. I didn't want anybody else to discover the secrets inside my new hideaway. I spent the next few hours trying to decipher what the symbols meant and where I had seen the symbol that I'd recognised before. It was whilst led in bed a couple of nights later that I remembered. It was in a history book. The symbol had been found on a cave wall in the Andes, believed to have been drawn tens of thousands of years ago. I would have to ask Mum where the book was now. Not all the boxes had been unpacked since the move, and it was sure to be in one of the unopened boxes. The next day at breakfast I asked Mum if she could help me find the book, but she informed me that she would be too busy, as she had to take Sophie and I into town to buy new school shoes. I protested that there was nothing wrong with my old ones, and Mum clearly wasn't in the mood for a fight, as she agreed that I could stay behind and go separately. Clearly she was mindful of the saying, divide and conquer. Mum directed me to the cellar, claiming the boxes that were yet to be unpacked had been placed down there to get them out of the way. Oh well, time to face my demons, I guess. At least it was daytime. No evil zombie, vampire or spirit would attack during the daytime. It was just an unwritten rule. Just to be safe though, I went up to my room and collected my Swiss Army knife and my torch. Mum hadn't been too happy when Grandad Blackwell had given it to me for Christmas last year, but he had argued that he had been given his first penknife at 10 years old, and my father had received his at 10 years old, and neither of them had come to any harm. Mum pointed out that Grandad was missing the tip of his index finger on his left hand, but Grandad was quick to point out that he had lost that whilst using a circular saw, and therefore promised never to buy me one of those. Mum had allowed me to keep the penknife, providing I used it carefully and didn't leave it lying around for Sophie to find. Before Robbie had died, he had shown me how to sharpen it, and then test the sharpness by pulling the blade open and dragging the thumb across the edge of the blade. I was always sure to keep the blade good and sharp. You never knew what emergency might present itself, and no self-respecting survival expert wants to be caught with a blunt knife. With my weapon of choice in one hand, with the blade exposed and held out in front of me, and a torch in the other, I ventured down into the cellar. There was a ceiling light below, however the bulb was old and tarnished. As the light didn't totally remove all of the shadows and dark areas of the cellar, I would use my torch to help scan the shadows for monsters or intruders. As I shone the torch down the stairs, I was relieved to find that the torchlight did not throw up anything ominous looking. I was, however, intrigued to hear a familiar sound. It was the same humming that I had heard from the shed keyhole. It was as if an electrical current was pulsing behind one of the cellar walls. As I got to the bottom of the stairs, I found the removal boxes lined up against the far wall next to the log store. Thankfully, Mum suffered a little from obsessive-compulsive disorder, and as such was always well organised. Each box had been carefully labelled, identifying its contents. I opened the box labelled Books, and after a little rummaging around, found the book that I was looking for, Mysteries of the Ancient World. I decided that I would read the book in the safety of my own bedroom, rather than remain in the cellar. After all, I didn't want to tempt fate. As I scanned the room one more time before leaving, the light of the torch reflected off of a shiny object which had been pushed into a recess in the wall. I walked over to the bare stone wall and reluctantly reached into the recess to retrieve whatever was in there. Had I been watching this unfold in a horror film, I would have been screaming at the actor not to be so stupid. However, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I reached into the recess and pulled out the old tin box. It was the size and shape of a typical child's school lunchbox. The tin looked to be a very old-fashioned biscuit tin, the type you might give out at Christmas. It was scratched and a little rusty, but opened easily. Inside I found a notebook, what looked to be a gold coin, some handwritten instructions, and to my delight, a large brass key. The key looked old